Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday. This is a battered little BookTube event, an ongoing tradition where a few people on BookTube, I don't think it's more than 3 or 4, read you a poem every week. And we're not just doing a poem every week on this channel. We have fallen into a kind of dramatic procession of poetry through the 20th century of American poetry using this anthology. I found this anthology, and it's a big, heavy thing, and I really like it. I really like it, even though, as we pointed out the last few times, as with any anthology, you're going to encounter the idiosyncrasies of the editors. That's just the price you pay for letting the editor do all the work, is that you give them a few idiosyncrasies. So they might pick a favorite poet that is now forgotten and refuse to admit that that poet is justly forgotten. So that poet will be in there. They might pick an obscure poet, assert that the poet isn't obscure, and give you 10 poems instead of the one that you should get at most. It's just the risk that you run. There, in any period, a century period where you're looking back, there are going to be some figures that absolutely command the landscape. You're not going to be able to short shrift them. If you want your book to have any chance of being picked up to be used in schools, which is a golden ticket if you're an editor, you're not going to want to short change those poets. So you're going to get a lot of T.S. Eliot, a lot of Robert Frost, that sort of thing. But this book moves in chronological order. And that's going to cause problems because in the middle of the 20th century, poetry flew off the train tracks into a crevasse on fire. And no survivors were in that wreckage. So we're going to hit trouble in this book. And it was announced last time we left the first section of this book and moved into the second section, which is early modernism. And that is setting up a drumbeat of tension, because that means we're getting closer and closer to 1956. That means we're getting closer and closer to poems where our Poetry Thursday sessions are going to be contentious. Very, very contentious. But not so far today. Real poetry will struggle on. It will last for quite some time. And that's what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with the great Amy Lowell. And I want to read you a poem of hers called Patterns. A few of her poems are included in here, but Patterns is the longest one. And I believe, unless I'm mistaken, that it is also the longest poem that I'll ever have read for Poetry Thursday. But who else is going to read Amy Lowell on YouTube? Nobody is. She's a great figure, a fascinating figure. The more you know about her, the more interesting she is. She really deserves a new biography, as so many of these people do. But I want to read you her poem, Patterns, and we'll see what you make of it. This poem, here, let me see, when was this come out? 1916. So we're still right at the beginning of the century. I walk down the garden paths, and all the daffodils are blowing, and the bright brew squills. I walk down the patterned garden paths in my stiff brocaded gown, with my powdered hair and jeweled fan. I, too, am a rare pattern, as I wander down the garden paths. My dress is richly figured, and the train makes a pink and silver stain on the gravel, and the thrift of the borders. I don't know if you're picking it up here. There's lots of buried rhyme here. Lots and lots of care went into these 5-word-long lines. Just a plate of current fashion, tripping by in high-heeled, ribboned shoes. Not a softness anywhere about me, only whalebone and brocade. And I sink on a seat in the shade of a lime tree, for my passion wars against the stiff brocade. The daffodils and squills flutter in the breeze as they please, and I weep. For the lime tree is in blossom, and one small flower has dropped upon my bosom. And the plashing of water drops in the marble fountain comes down the garden paths. The dripping never stops. Underneath my stiffened gown is the softness of a woman bathing in a marble basin, a basin in the midst of hedges grown so thick she cannot see her lover hiding, but she guesses he is near. And the sliding of the water seems the stroking of a dear hand upon her. What is summer in a fine brocaded gown? I should like to see it lying in a heap upon the ground, all the pink and silver crumpled on the ground. The stiff, formal figure in silk and brocade, and suddenly we're tipped into eroticism, and beautifully lyrical eroticism at that. I would be the pink and silver as I ran along the paths, and he would stumble after, bewildered by my laughter. I should see the sun flashing from his sword hilt and the buckle of his shoes. I would choose to lead him in a maze along the patterned paths, a bright and laughing maze with my heavy-booted lover. till he caught me in the shade, and the buttons of his waistcoat bruised my body as he clasped me, aching, melting, unafraid. With the shadows of the leaves and the sun drops and the plopping of the water drops all about us in the open afternoon, I am very like to swoon with the weight of this brocade, and the sun shifts through the shade. Underneath the fallen blossom in my bosom is a letter I have hid. It was brought to me this morning by a rider from the Duke. Madam, we regret to inform you that Lord Hartwell died in action Thursday sennight. As I read it in the white morning sunlight, the letters squirmed like snakes. Any answer, madam? Said the footman. No, I told him. See that the messenger takes some refreshment. No, no answer. And I walked into the garden, up and down the patterned paths, in my stiff, correct brocade. The blue and yellow flowers stood up proudly in the sun, each one. I stood upright too, held rigid to the pattern by the stiffness of my gown. Up and down I walked, up and down. In a month he would have been my husband. In a month, here, underneath this line, we would have broke the pattern, he for me and I for him, he as a colonel, I as a lady, on this shady seat. He had a whim that sunlight carried blessing, and I answered, it shall be as you have said. Now he is dead. In summer and in winter I shall walk up and down patterned garden paths in my stiff brocaded gown. The squills and daffodils will give place to pillared roses and to asters and to snow. I shall go up and down in my gown, gorgeously arrayed, boned and stayed, and the softness of my body will be guarded from embrace by each button, hook, and lace. For the man who should loose me is dead, fighting with the Duke in Flanders, in a pattern called war. Christ, what are patterns for? That's my girl. That's Amy Lowell. that is a pretty good start to a perilous period in American poetry. Very perilous. It doesn't get much better as a hopeful start than that. That is absolutely beautiful. Even if you study it on the page without hearing it, it is beautiful to see what the play of the lines, the length and lushness of the first half is blighted to almost monosyllabic simplicity in the second half once the letter is read, once we learn that her captain is dead. Beautiful the way the poem reflects the actions of the poem, just lovely. There are lots of sentence fragments. There's buried rhyme and rhythm all throughout, but none of it is classically done. And so we have both the perfect embodiment of modernism in poetry, which is the perfect embodiment of modernism in anything, which is the intensely personal, the intensely felt, the intensely intelligent, throwing off what it sees as the restrictive forms of earlier centuries, of earlier decades. But it doesn't have any of the negative parts of that, which is pure self-indulgence and navel staring, that we're going to see later on in this book, I guarantee. We're going to see willful ignorance, navel gazing to the nth degree. But not today. Today, that was wonderful. Just wonderful, as Amy Lowell is. She is wonderful. All of her stuff is wonderful. Unfortunately, next week, a glance at the table of contents shows us that the next poet is Gertrude Stein. So get ready. We'll see how that goes next week. Thank you, Bert.